Welcome back. This is the second video in the repair and not restoration, but fixing up of this boat. As you can see, I've already got some fairing compound down here. Since the last video, I have progressed a little bit. So the last video I left off, I still had some fiberglass on the sides and some of the original coating to touch up and a few odds and ends to do before I could get to this point to put the fairing compound down. I did record some video of me doing that, so right now we're going to go back in time and I'm going to show you the ways that I got all that off and things that I did and bring you up to the point where I was ready to put the fairing compound on. Basically, there's three different methods that I use to remove the fiberglass, epoxy, and coating that was on the bottom of this boat. The first is with a heat gun. A lot of times your epoxy and fiberglass, mostly the epoxy, will soften up with the heat gun and you can scrape it off. Also a belt sander and oscillating sander, which I'll touch on in a little bit. But for getting the edges of the bottom of the boat, the heat gun worked very, very well. Sometimes you kind of had to chip away at it, like this piece right here, and you just, heat it up and with a good scraper, just start chipping away and getting it off. Other times you could actually start one end of it, heat up a whole, foot and a half section or whatever, and it would peel right up. So you just kind of have to keep working at it. I would recommend wearing gloves because both the heat gun as well as the tool and most importantly the fiberglass on the boat gets pretty hot. So if you reach up and grab a piece that you like this that's just hanging there, you could burn yourself. This particular scraper I was able to heat up, along the corners and the edges and even just underneath a little bit. So it had some nice different points and shapes to it to get into little nooks and crannies. Then all I did was just keep going around the boat. Different sections, like I said, you could heat up the whole section like this one here and then start one end and then the whole thing peels off and then there's a little bit of cleanup to do. This was basically the process, just going around and around the boat with the heat gun, getting the fiberglass and epoxy off. The black coating that was on top of it, a lot of that just came off with it, but there were places where I scraped at it and, the loose stuff I wanted to get off. If it was on there really, really solid, I would just sand over it later to smooth it off. I wasn't going to worry about it. It was stuck. But see, it was nice. I had sections, a number of sections like this that just heated up and came right off without any problems. Others would start to come off and then kind of get stuck and you'd have to chip away at it. I don't recommend the heat gun for the entire bottom when I was first getting the fiberglass off the entire bottom. It's just too big. There are sections that were loose that I could pry up pretty easy. But if I had a 2x2 section to use the heat gun, it's awfully tedious. Belt sander tends to do a quicker job. So keep that in mind. I just kept working around the boat like this. I got all the fiberglass and epoxy off the sides. On the back 1/4 of the boat, it was nothing but the outer coating, the black coating on the boat. There was no fiberglass under that. And that definitely it will soften up with a heat gun, but it really doesn't come off that well. So some 60 grit on the belt sander took care of this real quick. Key to using a belt sander is don't stop. Just always keep it moving. And then after the belt sander, I came back with an oscillating random orbital sander. This particular one is cordless. The cordless ones don't quite have as much power as the corded ones, and that translates basically into, if you push down on this one to try and push the sandpaper into a particular spot, it'll slow down on you. It just doesn't have the power that a corded one does. But for this case, all I'm doing is just getting any loose materials off, softening up some edges, things like that. So this sander worked just fine. Once I had all of that removed, it was time to scrub the bottom of the boat. I thought about pressure washing it, but decided not to. So I've got some mild dish detergent and some warm soap here, not hot, just warm. A couple of different brushes, and I'm just going over all the little cracks and everything. And this is just mostly to get dirt and stuff out of it, out of those cracks and out of those holes. You just want to make certain that you have a nice clean surface. There's no grease, there's no wax, there's no oils or anything like that buried down in there. I went over the whole boat with this brush and the soapy water, and then rinsed it off. That was, for the most part, for the bottom, I think, good enough. Again, I could have used a pressure washer, but I think that did well. I rinsed the whole bottom off with just regular clean, tap water, and then proceeded to take a rag and go over it to wipe it down. It was going to be a couple of days before I got to the fairing compound, so I could have let it just sit by itself and dry. But what I wanted to do here, I knew that I still had some residual dust from the sanding and everything else on there. So I just wanted to take a rag and go over it just to try and collect some of that and get that off the bottom of the boat. As you can see from this rag right here, I've already gotten the other side and came around the back to the bow. And you take a look at this rag here, you can see there's still a lot of dust, and not necessarily dirt. It's more black dust that's on the boat. You can't see it, but it's there. So I went over that a couple of times, and then I took a old towel and just dried it off. I just buffed it all off. As I said, it was going to be a couple of days before I got to the fairing compound, but I wanted to make certain that I had it all dried off. Everything looked good. I looked over it one more time just to see if there was anything that needed to be sanded or touched up or anything. And at this point, everything looked pretty good, and I was pretty much ready to go ahead and do the fairing compound. So a couple of days ago, I was going to go ahead and get this fairing compound down, and I wanted to kind of narrate the video a little bit more than just kind of showing some video and the voiceover. Unfortunately, I had all kinds of the normal suburban type of sounds. I had some dogs barking that were whining, wanting in, and I had neighbors' kids that were squealing and screaming and having fun and things like that. And so it just would have interfered a little bit too much. I mean, as is, I get the normal outdoor sounds of chipmunks chirping and blue jays cawing and everything else. So I did get footage of that. That's what I'm going to show you now, is the footage of me cleaning this down, then me washing it with the prep wash, as well as mixing up the fairing compound. I had to mix up 4 batches of the fairing compound to get all of this on, and then me smearing this on. So I'll show you that footage, and I'll kind of narrate that a little bit to bring you up to just where we are right now. At this stage, I'm using the Totalboats prep wash dewaxer to wipe down the boat, just to get any grease off of it, to get any wax or anything off of it that would interfere with the Total Fair to actually bond to the bottom of the boat. I just poured some in a little dish and got a cotton rag and went over it, and just went over back and forth over the bottom of the boat, making certain that I got as much of that well, I got it all covered, but then also cleaned it all up. One thing I did do, because it was a couple of days after washing it and the last sanding, before I actually got to do the total fair, initially, which I did off screen, I just wiped down the boat with a damp cloth, came back with a dry towel just to dry it off. That was just to remove any pollen, any dust, or anything, bugs or whatever that had settled over the time where you just saw me finish washing it and then actually getting ready to do the total fair. So then the de-waxer, I'm just using, all up and down the back of the boat, just anywhere that I'm going to be using the total fair. Just wanting to make certain I get it in the little cracks and any holes, whatever I'm going to fill in. I want to make certain that the total fair is nice and clean and it will bond well, because on top of that will be my epoxy and glass. So that total fair has to have a nice bond with the bottom of the boat. I go through, finish the boat up. I took a fresh towel, wiped it down, gave it 15 minutes to make certain it was all dry before actually proceeding to doing the total fair. The interesting thing about the Totalboats Total Fair, and I don't have experience with any other company, so I can't speak to that, but they have a part A and B. It's a 1-to-1 mix, but they have one's a blue, one's a yellow. I know this looks more orange probably on screen, but they do that intentionally, and the reason is that when you mix it together, it will be green. So you'll know if you don't have it mixed thoroughly together, because you'll see little yellow and little blue streaks in your mix. Now here I'm just getting out an equal amount from each, just using a putty knife. I'm not weighing this. I'm not measuring this in any way other than I'm looking at each one and deciding that they are close enough to each other that it's going to work. I may be wrong in that regard, that I need to be more exact, but I can tell you from afterward that it all cured up very, very well. It's very, very hard. It filled in, it did its job. So I don't think this is something where you have to make certain they're both, the exact to within 1 ounce of each other, or anything like that. I'm not a fan of speeding up videos, but at the same time, I'm less of a fan of making you endure watching me mix this up and start to apply this. So I am speeding this up a little bit. I actually did not have a whole bunch of coffee to help me get this done quicker. But what I mostly wanted to show you was, as you can see, it becomes a nice uniform green color as you are mixing this all together. So, which is kind of nice. There's no guesswork. I found it was very, very easy to tell that I had it all mixed together. I wasn't, concerned or thinking that maybe I don't have it right and therefore it's not going to bond well or whatever. Nope. It all mixed together very, very well. It is very, very sticky. I highly recommend that you get one of these yellow plastic spreaders. Total Boat sells them. I think they come with the Total Fair, or at least the epoxy. I know they send some of those along with it. It's great for the application as well as mixing. You'll also notice that I did not mix up a large batch. You have about a 30-minute work time on the Total Fair. And what I found is after about 20 minutes or so, I could tell it was starting to thicken up a little bit. Still was workable, still very spreadable. Became more sticky, if that's the right word, stickier, and a little more effort to spread it around, not as opposed to when it was fresh. Like right here, it just goes in and it spreads around really, really easy. So keep that in mind. A big area like this, I ended up having to mix up 4 different batches, and each one was about this size. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so you don't want to, take out half half of each tub and mix it all up, because you probably won't get it spread on there in this application before all of it, half of it is no good. Now, if you're doing a different application like Andy Miller over at Boatworks Today, he's got a nice video of a hull that he's redoing, and he's mixing, a bunch of this stuff up, and he's spreading it out over fiberglass that he already put on this hull in big sections. He's got a huge spreader that he's spreading it around, and he's experienced, so he can get away with that. My view, if you're not experienced and you don't know what you're doing, you're better off just mixing up small batches, even if you have to mix up a number of them. So all I'm doing here is using the putty knife to get the Total Fair down into the holes that are in the bottom of the boat. If you haven't seen the previous video I did where I spoke about those, the thought is that those were one time put in there to help dry the wood out. Obviously, somebody who put when they put the previous fiberglass coating on there had filled those in with resin. Most of those still had some epoxy resin in there, but a few of them, as I took the fiberglass off, they popped out of those holes. So I got to make certain that all of that is filled in. I don't get any air pockets under my fiberglass that I'm going to put on. So it's just a matter of going over the bottom here and just filling in every little hole. I found it best just to go through and fill the holes in, because you kind of have to push that Total Fair down into it. Then take the yellow scraper and just swipe up a whole area just to get the excess off. Now, eventually I stopped using the putty knife because all the little holes were filled, and now I had some larger cracks not cracks, I shouldn't say that, I had larger scratches that I needed to fill in, and it was much easier just to use the yellow spreader that came with it. At this point, I think my first batch is starting to thicken up, and I don't know if you can tell, but it's just not spreading quite as smooth and easy. A little bit more work to it, but I think it did just fine. I probably could have gone ahead and just left a little bit of extra fairing compound on the hull and just sand it back. In the beginning, when I was getting those holes and everything, I was just interested in just filling in the holes, so I was scraping the excess off. When it got to the point where on the back end here, towards the stern, I'm filling in these cracks, I just decided to go ahead and leave a little bit extra fairing compound on top of those cracks and then sand down to the hull, as opposed to trying to just fill in that crack, because some of them were so shallow, as I would scrape off the fairing compound, it would actually pull the fairing compound out of that crack. So as you can see, when I'm working around on the areas of the boat where there's still epoxy, the original hull of the boat, and filling in cracks, I left just a little bit extra just to have a little bit more to sand back. One thing I do want to comment on real quick, you'll notice I have a piece of plywood that I'm mixing my fairing compound on. That is a finished piece of birch plywood. It's cabinet plywood because I happen to be remodeling a kitchen too. Scrap that was laying around. I highly recommend, if you're doing something like this, you have some sort of plastic or at least a piece of plywood that has a number of coats of polyurethane or something on it. The fairing compound mixes up well, and it scrapes well, and it cleans up well. You want to use the de-wax and prep material for cleaning that up. But it's very, very workable. If it was just a regular piece of plywood, it would be sticking to it, and you'd probably be pulling some wood off into it. So I'm just finishing up. All I'm doing is going around getting anything else that I think needs a little bit more fairing compound, and then I let it dry. It took about 3 or 4 hours to dry, and then it's ready to sand. So now you see where we're at. We've got all of this, the fairing compound down. I think I got all the scratches and the little dings and stuff on the bottom filled in. So the next steps are going to be, I have to sand down the sides. We need to get any remaining decals off, any of their gunk off from the decals. I need to just sand this down to rough it up for receiving primer and paint. There's some scratches on here, so I'm probably going to use a little fairing compound on that to fill those in. I got some holes where various bolts and things were put in at different times for different features on it, and I'm probably just going to fill those in for now. And then when I mount the hardware, I'll go ahead and just drill fresh holes for it. So I get that all sanded and get the fairing compound on there like this. Then I sand all the sides. I sand all of this smooth. Then I double check to see if I have any other scratches or anything that I've missed that I want to smooth off. If I do, I'll fill those in, I'll sand it down and get it ready. Once I have it to the point where I don't have any more, then I will mask off the lower portion right here of the boat, and then I'll use the prep wash once again to make certain it's nice and clean. I have to put a very thin layer of epoxy down on this so that the subsequent fiberglass and epoxy has a nice solid epoxy surface to bond to. So once I do that, then it's just a matter of getting the glass on here with some epoxy, another layer of glass and the epoxy. Once I have those done, then all I have to do is hit it with the paint primer and then a couple coats of black paint, and then this portion's done. At the same time, I'll then flip over and I'll mask this part of it, and then I'll prime and paint the sides here, and that will actually complete the whole bottom and sides, and we can flip it over and start working on the interior. So the plan is this next week to be getting this sanded down, the sides prepped, get the fairing done on those, and be in a position by this weekend to go ahead and start putting the fiberglass and the epoxy down, and then maybe even another week or so get the painting done. So that will be the third video. Thanks for watching. I hope there's some things here that people are learning. When I'm doing the epoxy, I will talk a little bit more about the epoxy in terms of what I'm using, as well as temperatures, durations, sanding, not sanding, all that kind of stuff. So I'll go into that a little bit more in depth. But thanks for watching. Just remember, boat repair. You're not having fun, you're doing it wrong, I think. Thanks. Various other suburban sounds, and it just would have been too much interference. As is, you probably hear some chipmunks not twerking. Let me start that all over again.